I heard a comedian once say, we actually have 4 kids, and it's amazing. And I heard this comedian talking about making this leap from 3 to 4 kids, and what a leap that is. And this comedian summed it up perfectly. He said, going from 3 kids to 4 kids, he said it's like this. Imagine you're drowning, and somebody hands you a baby. And that's about it right there, right? So that's going from 3 to 4. Now, if you're not a parent today, and maybe you're sitting here and you're thinking, boy, did I pick the wrong week to start attending church, right? But I don't think so. I think that this talk is for everybody, and here's why. You're either a parent today, you're going to be a parent someday, or you know somebody that is a parent. And if you just know somebody that's a parent, you can be a blessing to them through some of the things that we're going to talk about today and even over the next couple of weeks. Now, I think when it comes to parenting, we all set out with great intentions, right? I don't think any of us ever wake up and we say, gosh, I sure hope to be average at this whole parenting thing, right? None of us rolled into it with that mindset, I don't think. We all wanted to be great. But success as a parent, I think it means different things to each of us. If we asked each person here, what does it mean? We would all have a different answer. For some of you, it's all about the academics, right? It's all about school. And you're that parent that your kid has to get straight A's, right? Your kid has to be on the honor roll because then you get one of those bumper stickers for your car, which is kind of cool. Your kid has to get into that Ivy League school. And to you, perhaps that's the definition. That's the measuring stick of what it means to be a great parent. Others, maybe it's all about sports. Everything is about sports. This is a house I grew up in, and everything was about sports. This was kind of my dad's love language to me, and this is how we communicated, and this was our relationship. And it wasn't just about sports in our house. It was about winning. There was winning, and then there was everything else, right? It was first place, and if you were second place, that was sort of like what we called first loser. And so it was all about winning. There were no participation trophies in our house, and we poured everything into that. In fact, my dad, he was so obsessed with sports that as we would watch sports, sometimes I'd find myself watching a sports program, and we'd be watching 2 teams play a game that I don't know who the 2 teams are, and I don't like the sport that they're playing, yet we're watching it, right? Because that was important time for me and my dad. Now, if that's you today, maybe that's you, and that's where you're at, and you feel like, sports are my life, I just want to encourage you. I want you to know something, that 1% of high school athletes go on to play in college, and 1% of those go on to play in the pros, okay? So I just want to encourage you to do this. Focus some of your time and effort and energy on something that is far more eternal than sports activities. For some of you, maybe it's something completely different. It's the hobbies. It's these types of things. Maybe it's music. It's art. These things, right? You have this little artist at your house, and that artist is going to be the next Picasso for sure, right? And maybe you've got this kid that's amazing on his instrument, and they're going to turn out to be the next Mozart, or even greater yet, they're going to turn out to be the next great worship leader like Hubains. And look, guys, I'm not suggesting that there's necessarily anything wrong with all of those things, right? Music, sports, activities, all of it, good grades, all of that stuff is good. There's nothing wrong with any of that, on the surface. But what I want to try to do today is I want to try to talk to you about parenting from a completely different angle, from a completely different perspective, from a godly perspective. Parenting with a purpose and parenting with a God-centered approach. So, here's a question for you this morning. If I asked you guys to prioritize these things, we're going to show these up here on the screen. If I asked you to prioritize these words here, we see family, work, hobbies, sports, these things. If you guys were to put these in order and of what they should be in order of significance in our lives, I think most of us, if we looked at it for a moment or two, we would probably get them in the right order, right? You'd be able to answer the question right and pass this test. And I think probably most of us would agree that this is what the right order would look like, right? We'd see that God and family, we'd see the right order of things. However, even though we'd answer the question right, I'm a firm believer in this. I believe that if I look at somebody's schedule and I look at their bank account, I can determine a lot about somebody's priorities. In other words, if I look at where you spend your time and your money, I can see what is most important to you. I went to a seminar recently. It was quite interesting. There was this amazing speaker there, and this speaker offered some perspective on this. He was speaking to a group of godly men. He was trying to, or they may personally weren't all godly men. He was trying to help us to be godly men, and he was trying to help us have perspective on raising our boys, our sons specifically. But one of the things that he mentioned, and I made sure I took a note of it because I thought it was so enlightening, was he said, if you want to do a good self-examination of where you're at on something, he said, do this. Ask yourself this question: who or what do I love the most? So who or what do I love the most? And you guys can do this when you get home today. So who or what do I love the most? And then as soon as you ask that question, open up your Facebook and open up your Instagram side by side and scroll through your last 50 posts. Very enlightening. You're going to see very quickly who it is or what it is that you love the most. Are your posts driving people to help people find and follow Jesus? Are they encouraging others? You'll be able to answer that question for yourself. So, guys, that when we look at parenting with a priority, when we try to make parenting a top priority, one of the things that we're going to see is that our kids, they notice everything that we do. Our kids, they learn from us, right? They're a great witness. They see it all. They hear it all. Nothing slips by them when they're watching us. So as a Christian and as a parent, both of those together, what should be our biggest priority as it relates to our kids? What should it be? So let's look to the Bible for this for just a second here. Deuteronomy 6 says this: a parent's priority is to gradually transfer a child's dependence away from the parents until their dependence rests solely on God. In other words, guys, when you think about our children, think about little kids. If you have little kids today, your little kids, they rely on you for everything, right? They're dependent. They can't hardly do anything. And as they get a little bit older, they can sort of do a couple things here and there, simple things, right? They start to tie their shoe or whatever. They get dressed themselves. These are all big victories. They go to the bathroom themselves. And as they get a little bit older, these things increase and increase and increase. But the Bible tells us that our job is to gradually transfer them from being totally dependent on us to being totally dependent on God. We need to teach them this process. Now, just to set the context of this, in Deuteronomy 5, so right before this happened, Moses had just come down and he had just received the 10 Commandments, right? A lot of you are probably familiar with this story. So Moses has the 10 Commandments, and these were the principles, these were the 10 principles that the Israelites were going to live by. These were pretty important, pretty big deal, that the Israelites were going to live by. And then right after this, in Deuteronomy 6, we're given the two most important principles that we will ever live out as a parent. Okay, so on your outline today, when you came in, you got your outline in your packet there. If you're following along, if you want to take notes today, this would be a good place to start. Okay, so two things that Scripture tells us about transferring our kids' dependence to God. Point number one on your outline is this: Scripture teaches us to fully love God, right? To fully love God. Deuteronomy 6:5 says this: love the Lord God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. Right? Now, initially, you look at that verse and you're thinking, okay, I don't get it. What does that have to do with parenting? Right? So I'm supposed to love God, and somehow that transitions into me being a good parent. We're going to come back to that. I think by the time we're done with this, you're going to fully see how this very specifically ties into being a great parent. But first, I want to look at that verse, and I want us to notice something really important in that verse. It says to love God with all, right? It doesn't say love God with some of your heart. It doesn't say give him a percentage of your heart or a fraction of your heart. It says to love God with all your heart. And I think that's really important, because I think if we're honest today, I think if everybody self-examines himself, if we're honest, I think sometimes we have a tendency to give God some of our love, right? We have a tendency to put a lot of other things ahead of God and give him only some of our love. And you might be here today and you might be saying, John, that's just not true. That's not me. I always put God first in everything that I do. Do you? Okay. Do your actions and your priorities, the ones that your kids see every day, the ones that they're the witness to, do they align with that statement? Only you know. I don't know. but your kids do see. So what I mean here, guys, is are you giving God your first and your best? Or does God sort of get your leftovers at the end of the day? Think about kind of your day and as it unfolds, right? Do you give God your first and your best? Or does your day look a little bit more like this? I have a list of this many things I need to get done, and I'm going to get them all done because that's just how I am. And when I get to the end of my day and I'm ready to go to bed and I'm tired and I'm exhausted, I got nothing else left to do except for lay down on that bed and go to sleep, is that when you think, maybe I should crack open the Bible and read for a few minutes? Right? Is that giving God your first and best, or is that sort of giving God your leftovers? So here's the thing. We're to love God with all our hearts, and we're to do this as an example to our kids. Because when we do this as an example for our kids, it sets the priorities so that our kids can see this. Now, I know for some of you, a typical day in your house, many of you raised your hands, 3, 4, 5 kids, I get it. A typical day can be a bit chaotic. I fully understand this. And I'll share with you, a typical day at my house, here's what it looks like. I get up, I rush off to work, most days without speaking to my kids. Then I work all day, I come home from work, I rush in the house just in time to grab whichever kids have activities that night, and we rush out the door, and we've got to get them to sports and to music and to this and to that and whatever other 19 things that they have going on. And right about the time those activities are getting over, we get home just in time. By 7, 8, 9 o'clock at night, we're eating dinner, only to rush our kids to bed so that I can have some me time. Sound familiar to anybody? That's kind of a typical day in so many of our houses. So when we look at a day like that, let's do this. Let's get real practical for a minute here. And let's look and we say, when I look at that day, where do I put God into that equation? How does God seem to factor any of that mess that we call life, right? Where do we put him? So here's some things. Here's some practical things that we could try to do. We could get up a few minutes earlier, right? I'm not much of a morning person. Everybody that knows me knows that. I'm not much of a morning person. But what if I got up a few minutes earlier each day, and I said, today, I'm going to start getting up in the morning, I'm going to read my Bible, and I'm going to pray. Maybe it's those things. I start with something simple. Now, I can choose to read my Bible and pray all by myself, or I can choose to read my Bible and pray with my kids. And trust me, both will have benefits. There's no right answer there, right? So sometimes I'm going to do it by myself because my kids are going to see that, and they're going to recognize that this is important for me to have some God time. On the other hand, there's going to be times where I do it with my kids because then my kids start to understand it. They start to learn. They start to develop the pattern. Okay, so they'll pick up on that. Here's one you could do. How about as you're rushing your kids around all these things and you're taking them to school and you're taking them to their activities, what if along the way you prayed with them? Kids have a lot of challenges, right? They might be dealing with something at school. They might be dealing with something on one of their teams. They might be dealing with that kid they don't like, that teacher they don't like, whatever, the class they don't like. What if you just took a moment and prayed with them? Offer them some encouragement as they go out and take on the day. One of the things I like to do, I like to talk to my kids about the gifts that God has given them. So we'll have that conversation sometimes as we're heading off to sports and things. I'll talk to them about the gifts that God has given them and how can they use those gifts to benefit others and to be honoring to God. That's a great conversation that puts things into perspective. Real simple one. What if you asked your kids, when you're sitting around the dinner table at night, what if you asked them to lead the family in prayer? Right? We do that every night. I ask one of the kids, lead the family in prayer. You know why? Because it's easy for them to do. They like to do it. And it starts to develop a habit in them in getting them ready to do it. One of my favorite things that we do, and we do this almost every night, at some point during dinner, when all the dust is settled and everybody's got their food and their water, and finally we can actually sit down at the table, I always yell this. I always say this. I go, Bible trivia. And there we go. And that's the result. It's like this call and response thing. That's my family. And what we do is every night when I say this Bible trivia, it kicks off this time where we start to do Bible trivia around the house, around the table. And everybody participates, right down to my 2-year-old. I've got a 10 and an 8 and a 5 and a 2. And I keep it simple, and I keep the questions age appropriate. And even the 2-year-old gets to participate. And you know what the answer is? Every question for my 2-year-old, the answer is always Jesus. And I think that that's just a good lesson for all of us, because isn't the answer always Jesus? Right? It's great perspective. How about when you're putting your kids to bed, you just take a few minutes and pray with them, right? I know it's easy to rush the kids off to bed. I need that me time, but how about I just pray with them? One more thing you could choose to do is gather some folks at your house once a week and lead a Bible study. Lead a life group. Your kids are going to see a bunch of godly people show up to your house once a week and talk about what God's doing in their life. Talk about their relationship with Jesus. The impact of this, guys, if you actually lived it out like this, day in and day out, day in and out, the impact of this and the impression it's making on your kids as you go will have a long-lasting result. So parents, I think you can see that the best thing we can do and the first thing we can do is we can love God with all our heart. If we start there, it's hard to mess up the rest of it, right? So if we start by putting God first, we'll get it right. Now, number 2 on your outline is this. Scripture teaches us that we need to lead our family. So number 1, we love God with our heart, all our heart. And number 2, we lead our families. Now, in Deuteronomy 6, verses 6 through 9, it says this, and I love this because it really sets the table for this spiritual leadership that we're talking about here. It says this, "These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie in bed and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands, bind them to your foreheads, write them on your door frames of your houses and on your gates." Wow. Now that's some spiritual leadership, right? Imagine doing all those things, right? When we look at those examples of what they're talking about here. Now back in the day that this was written, back in the days of Moses, understand that these Jewish people, they would have fully understood this. They would have completely embraced this. They memorized the Scripture, every word of it. And then not only did they memorize it, but they wrote it on their houses, for crying out loud, right? And I'm not suggesting all you kids go write this on your houses, but they wrote it on the door frames of their houses. They would write it on little scrolls of paper, and they would roll them up, and they would put them in this little box, and they would attach it to their head. Now, I heard recently that fashion statement is actually making a comeback, so be ready for that. But all of these actions, you guys, they clearly conveyed a message that this was important. The kids could not have missed this message of how important it was. Here's a simple one that we can all do. Just show up on Sunday. Just show up on Sunday. It's an hour of your week, right? Show up and bring your kids. The statistics surrounding this are quite staggering. They're really interesting, guys. Parents that show up with their kids to church, here's how the statistics lay out. If a mom and dad attend church regularly and bring their kids, 74% of those kids will continue to go to church as an adult. If a mom only shows up on Sundays, only 3% of those kids are going to continue to pursue church as an adult. And if a dad only attends, 38% of those kids will continue to go to church as an adult. Guys, we have to set the tone. We have to instill it in our kids that church is important. It's important to show up here and have this communion and have this worship time and to learn and further our relationship with God. You know, I make this a priority in our house, and my kids understand it. They get up before I do. They're ready to go. They can't wait to get to church. They get really upset if we ever have to miss, and they love church. But one of the things, this happened the other day. This was actually pretty cool. The twin season was just about to start. So this was a few weeks ago here. The twin season was getting ready to kick off. This was when we still had hopes that they would have a good team. And they were about ready to start, and my son, he went and grabbed the Twins baseball schedule. And as he was looking through the Twins baseball schedule, he's staring at it for a little while. And you know what the first thing he said, his first thing he said about the schedule? It wasn't who the season opener was. It wasn't when the first home game is or anything like that. This is what he said. The first thing out of his mouth was, "This isn't good." And I looked at him and I said, "Well, what isn't good?" He said, "Well, this isn't good. With these guys' schedule, they're not going to be able to get to church over the next couple of months." Wow. 8-year-old perspective, right? He understood that these guys are going to have to miss church to play a silly game. Wow. That's eternal perspective, guys. Look at it from that angle. Dads, those of you that are dads in here today, I can't stress enough how important it is that you lead your family spiritually. You are the spiritual leader. And when you lead this way, it will have a lifelong impact on your family. I saw this quote by a guy named Edward, the Duke of Windsor. And he said this about America. He said, "The thing that impresses me most about Americans is the way parents obey their children." Right? The way parents obey their children. So parents, here's the question. Are you leading your children, or are your children leading you? Think about this from a spiritual perspective. Do you set the spiritual tone in your house? Is there a spiritual tone in your house? You're the divine authority within that household, and it's up to you to set the tone day in and day out. Now, you might be wondering, how do I do that, right? How do I set that spiritual tone? How do I be that leader? I think that's a fair question, right? And guys, I think it looks different for everybody. I wish it was a simple one-size-fits-all thing, but I think it's different for each and every one of us as we go through this process. There's not like I'm going to give you the 10-step process to successful parenting. But one thing I can tell you with certainty, if you want to be the leader of your house and you want to be a strong spiritual leader in your household, you have to lead intentionally. Okay, you have to lead intentionally in order to do this. So how do I do that? Well, here's a good place to start. Start with prayer. You remember a few series ago, we did a series on prayer, you might recall. And one of the things that we talked about in that prayer series was going to God first in prayer. We have this tendency to go to God last, right? When we've tried everything on our own and everything else has failed, we have nothing left to try, we go to God. Well, when it comes to parenting and navigating this roadway with your family and trying to figure out how to lead them spiritually, why not go to God first? What better expert could you possibly turn to for advice? So turn to God and seek Him out. And when you do this, it'll be your first step in leading your family intentionally. Now, there are several other simple things that we can do that will help set the tone for your family. Here's an easy one. How about we get involved serving? Serving right here on Sundays, it's pretty easy. It's pretty easy. Guys, everything that you see when you come in on Sundays, none of it happens by accident. Like there are actually people that show up early and they set this stuff up. They set the kids area up. Okay, the people that greet you when you walk in the door. Or here's a big one, the kids area back there with those 35, 40 kids every Sunday, they need your help. They need people back there to help assist and help with those kids. Everything happens for a reason. We tear down the church at the end of every Sunday here and put stuff away. So there's an easy opportunity to serve. And you don't have to just serve at church. Serve in your community. Go feed the poor. Do something. But get involved in serving. And you can include your kids. If they're of the age where they can help out, have them show up with you and help set up and tear down and greet and do whatever it is that you want to do, because it starts to set the tone for them. How about giving? Giving is an easy one, right? Well, maybe it's not. It's a hard one for most people. Giving is something that we can do, right? And we want to give generously. Give generously. Go out and sponsor a child. You know how cool that is when your kids get to see you sponsoring a child and they exchange letters with this child that you're sponsoring and see how that child's growing? It's a really easy one to do. Maybe pick one family at Christmas time and say, I'm going to sponsor this family with their Christmas needs. Now, it might be, for some of you, that might be sacrificing a little bit of your own Christmas needs to help this family that has nothing. But wow, what a lifelong impression that will have on your kids. Prioritizing, like we just talked about, right? Setting the day up. So my day starts with God, it ends with God, and then maybe I've got a few checkpoints with God along the way. Start to prioritize your day. And here's another one that's so powerful. Just love others. Just love others. Be kind and be gentle. Be a reflection of Jesus. Right? If we just love others, your kids will see it. Your kids will learn from how you love others, guys. Now, we know that, I hear it said all the time, Jesus sees everything, right? He's everywhere. He sees everything we do. I think we get that. And so a lot of times we do things and we think, well, Jesus sees this. We're pleasing to God. But you know who else sees almost everything that you do? Your kids. Your kids see it. They hear it. They see it. They witness it. And so everything that we're doing, you guys, as parents, is feeding them. So important that we set this tone. Now, in this world, guys, I know that it's easy to get caught up and we look around and we look at what other families are doing. But just because another family is doing something, that doesn't necessarily mean it's right for your family. Okay, maybe it doesn't meet the right standard for your family. You don't have to do it. The right thing to do for your family often, guys, is be far less concerned about your child's immediate happiness, that happiness in the moment, and be far more concerned about their eternal holiness. That's where we want to lean towards. So how do we lead them? Well, we train them. We train them. We coach them. We mentor them. We groom them. Proverbs 22:6 says this, "Start children off the way they should go, and even when they are old, they will not turn from it." There's another variation of this that says, "Train up a child in the way they should go." Now, in the ancient world, in the Hebrews, when the Hebrews were running around and when this was going on, this whole idea of starting off or training my child, coaching my child, training my child, the whole idea of that, it's centered around actually when Israelite women, they would have a baby, and they had a midwife that was present. And one of the things that the midwife would do was they would actually take a paste and they would put it on the palate, the top of the child's mouth. And what this would do is this would initiate a hunger so that the child would start to nurse. And in the same way, you guys, that's what we are doing when we are training up and when we are teaching and when we are coaching our kids along this journey. We are initiating that hunger. That hunger for Christ is what we're trying to initiate. And when we initiate the hunger, guys, we have to feed it. We have to feed it daily. We can't just initiate it and then say, okay, check that box, I'm done. We actually have to feed it daily. So remember at the start of the talk, we started off and we said this. Our role is to transfer dependence from our children so that they no longer depend on us, but they depend on who? They depend on God. Fully. They fully depend on God. So how do we do it? I'm going to recap here. We'll summarize it right up here. First, it starts with us loving God. That's the first box. We have to love God, and we have to do it fully, and we have to do it obviously, and our kids will see this, and they'll be influenced by this. Second, we intentionally lead our families. We can't just let life happen and hope for the best result, and wherever the chips lay, that's where they'll lay. We can't do that. Here's what will happen if we try to parent that way, guys. This is what will happen, and I promise it's going to end up this way. You're going to get to a point someday, you're going to kiss your kids goodbye, you're going to send them down the aisle, you're going to push them off to college, they will eventually have moved out, and you're going to be standing there and you're going to be wondering, are they ready? Right? Are they ready? Did I prepare them properly? Here's a big one. Do they know and love Jesus? Right? What more important thing could you possibly ask your kids and hope for in their life? Ultimately, then, do they know and love Jesus? So here's one last thought before we wrap up today. When you are raising your kids, guys, and you're leading them spiritually and you're leading them in this way, you are not just affecting just your kids, just the immediate result of your kids. And I know that's probably the most important thing today, is affecting them. But ultimately, you are setting up generations to come to know and love Jesus. But the opposite of this can also be true. The opposite impact can happen. In the book of Judges, you guys, in the Old Testament, we see this story of the Israelites, the people that God had freed, right, through Moses, and they wandered through the desert all these years, for 40 years, and eventually, some of them crossed over the Jordan River, and they made it into this promised land that God had offered them. They finally got there, they made it there. And those adults, they knew the stories, they knew what God had done with them, they knew the miracles, but you know what they did? They failed to teach their kids. They failed to pass on any of that to their kids. And the Bible tells us that the very next generation, essentially the first next generation in the promised land, they didn't know God. They didn't know the stories, they didn't know what God had done for them, and as a result, they became pagans, They became idol worshipers, and they completely turned from God. And the result of this, you guys, was total, utter devastation. Not only just for that generation, but for several generations to come. It was total devastation. I want to leave you with this bit of encouragement. Trust God, you guys. Trust God that He placed you in this role called a parent. He placed you there for a reason. He wants you to lead your family. He wants you to teach them. He wants you to initiate this love and this passion for Him. And then He wants you to guide them every step of the journey until they're ready. And at some point when they're ready, He wants you to hand it over to Him and allow those kids to be totally 100% dependent on God.